September 1st, 1944, in the Maritime Alps of southern France, in the ridges above a village called Les Garens, two men are moving through mountains they have never seen before. One is a private of the 1st Special Service Force. The other is Reconnaissance Sergeant Tommy Prince, a trapper's son from Scanterbury, Manitoba, a descendant of the great Salto Chief Pegasus. Somewhere ahead of them, an entire German reserve battalion has gone to ground. Its gun positions are folded into the terrain. Its encampment sits where no Allied aircraft and no artillery observer has managed to find it. That is the whole point of the German position. Stay hidden, stay alive. Prince and his partner will spend 72 hours behind German lines without food or water. Prince will cover roughly 70 kilometers on foot across some of the roughest country in Europe, and at the end of it, he will hand his commanders something no aerial photograph and no radio intercept had produced: the exact location of the hidden battalion, its guns, its camp, everything. The American Silver Star citation that followed opens with words a soldier rarely hears about a reconnaissance report. So accurate was the report rendered by the patrol that on September 5th, his regiment moved forward, occupied the heights, and wiped out the encampment. Around Les Garens, the force killed or captured a German battalion of roughly 1,000 men. Stop and think about what actually happened on that ridge. The battalion did everything an army is taught to do in order to disappear, and one man from a Manitoba reserve read those mountains like a printed page and found them anyway. Put yourself in the place of that German battalion commander for a moment. You have obeyed every rule of concealment your army has drilled since 1915. Your fires are cold, your vehicles are netted, your men are silent, and an enemy regiment still walks out of the hills straight to your tents as if someone had mailed them your address. What would you conclude? What could you possibly conclude? Here is the uncomfortable part for military historians. This was not a one-time miracle. It is a pattern, and it repeats across 2 world wars in Korea. In the mud of Flanders in 1915, on a canal at Anzio in 1944, on night patrols in the Korean hills in 1951, again and again, an enemy of Canada tried to hide something: a sniper, a battery, a camp, a line of retreat. And again, Canadian reconnaissance men found it. The Germans at Anzio eventually produced their own explanation for this. They whispered about devils. The real answer is stranger than devils and far more interesting. It is not a technology, it is not genetics, and it is not luck. It is an idea about evidence, about what movement does to the world, and about who can read what movement leaves behind. Today, we're running a forensic audit on that idea. And to understand why hiding a trail never worked against these men, we have to go back 30 years before the ridge in France, back to the mud of Belgium, where the modern art of hiding was invented, and then further back still to a trap line in the Manitoba bush, where a boy was learning a language most of the world never knew existed. In the winter of 1914, the Western Front did something no battlefield had ever done before. It froze in place, and then it vanished. Both sides dug trenches, dugouts, tunnels, saps. Within months, anything that showed itself above ground level for more than a few seconds died. The French army coined a brand new word in 1915 for the industry this created: camouflage. Painted canvas, screens, dummy trees with steel cores, fake corpses used as observation posts. German marksmen with scoped hunting rifles owned the early years of this invisible war, and every army scrambled to catch up. The central military problem of the 20th century announced itself right there. How do you kill what you cannot see? And harder still, how do you find a man whose entire profession is not being found? Canada arrived at the problem carrying an asset nobody had planned for. More than 4,000 First Nations men volunteered for the Canadian Expeditionary Force. By some estimates, roughly 1 in 3 of those of military age from communities where hunting and trapping were not hobbies, but the economy itself. Recruiters and battalion commanders, guided partly by genuine skill and partly, let's be honest, by stereotype, funneled many of them into the 2 most dangerous jobs at the front: sniping and scouting. The historian of Indigenous service quoted in Canada's official military history put it flatly: in battle, the skills of the Indian hunter and warrior came to the fore. Consider what that sentence looked like as a human being. Francis Pegamagabao, an Ojibwe from what is now Wasauksing First Nation on Georgian Bay, was orphaned as a small child and raised by an elder named Noah Nebimanyaquad, who taught him to hunt, fish, and read the bush. In August 1914, within days of the declaration of war, he volunteered. At the training camp at Valcartier, he decorated his army tent with a caribou, the symbol of his clan. He carried something else with him, too. At an Ojibwe camp on Lake Superior in 1914, an elder had pressed a tiny medicine bag into his hands and told him, as Pegamagabo himself recounted to an anthropologist years later, that he would shortly go into great danger. In February 1915, he landed in France with the very first Canadian Division. His method was documented by the men around him. He crept out into no man's land at night, the one strip of earth where standing up meant death, buried himself in cover, and waited with a patience his comrades found almost unhuman. It has been written of him that his iron nerves, patience, and superb marksmanship made him an outstanding sniper. By the end of the war, he was credited with 378 kills, the most effective sniper on any side of the entire conflict. But look past the kill count because there is a second number that matters more for our story. Roughly 300 Germans captured. Remember the captures. The kills tell you about his rifle. The captures tell you about something else entirely, and we will come back to them in a moment. The decorations piled up. A military medal for carrying messages under fire through Ypres, Festubert, and Givenchy. Work that meant crossing ground everyone else avoided. Gassed at Second Ypres, his lungs damaged for life. Shot in the leg on the Somme, a note in his medical file records he was sent back into the line the following day. A bar to his medal at Passchendaele, where he found lost reinforcements at night in a landscape of flooded shell craters and guided them into position. A second bar in 1918 at the Scarpa for going out over open ground under machine gun fire to bring back ammunition when his company was nearly surrounded. Only 39 men in the entire Canadian Expeditionary Force ever wore the military medal with 2 bars. Now the captures. You cannot capture 300 men from a distance. Capture means approach, getting so close, unheard, and unseen that surrender suddenly looks like the reasonable option. His son Duncan later repeated what his mother had told him, that his father would go behind enemy lines, rub shoulders with the enemy forces and never get caught, and understand who he was doing this to. The German army of that war was the best hidden fighting force on earth. Steel loopholes, painted screens, trench periscopes, decoys, discipline. The men being found by this quiet Ojibwe corporal were professionals of not being found. That is the first return on the promise in this video's title, so mark it. The failure of concealment did not start in 1944. It started here. He was not alone. Henry Norwest, a Métis of Cree descent from Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta, had been a ranch hand and a rodeo performer before the war. His Army career opened badly. Enlisted in January 1915, discharged within 3 months for misbehavior, then signed up again under a new name with the 50th Battalion out of Calgary. His specialty became the hardest version of the whole problem, counter-sniping, hunting the hiders themselves. Comrade Victor Wheeler described how Norwest would lie motionless in a camouflage blind for hours, sometimes days, waiting. He worked with an official observer, Private Oliver Payne, who confirmed every witnessed shot. 115 in all, one of the highest verified tallies in the British Empire's armies. And since he counted only what Payne saw with his own eyes, the true figure can only be higher. Wheeler recorded that, according to German prisoners, Norwest was intensely feared by the foe. He earned the military medal at a fortified knob on Vimy Ridge. The soldiers called the pimple and a bar to it in 1918. So, here is the first piece of the answer this video promised you. What these men brought to Flanders was not eyesight, and it was not magic. It was a habit of reading, treating a stretch of ground as a page on which everything that moves has to write. The Army did not teach that habit. The Army merely discovered to its own surprise that it had recruited it. But do not mistake this for a story without losses, because the hiders sometimes won around. On August 18, 1918, 3 months before the armistice, Norwest and 2 others went out hunting a nest of German marksmen that had been punishing the battalion. A single enemy bullet found him first. He died instantly, and what happened next tells you exactly what he had meant to the Canadian Corps. The artillery was ordered to open up on the German positions. A thundering salute for a lance corporal. A fellow soldier wrote that their famous marksman had understood, better than any of them, the cost of life and the price of death. Then the war ended. The reports praised these men in print, and the country sent them home to reserves where they could not even vote, and largely forgot them. The reading of ground went back to the trap lines and seemed to exit history altogether. It did not. 24 years later, a recruiting letter began to circulate through two armies at once, Canadian and American. It asked for single men, 21 to 35, and under occupations preferred. It listed something no modern army had ever written into the specification of a fighting unit. To understand why that list was written and what it had to do with a boy on a Manitoba reserve putting bullets through a playing card at 100 miles, you first need to learn what tracking actually is, because it is almost certainly not what you think. Scanterbury, Manitoba, the 1920s. Thomas George Prince was born in October 1915 in a canvas tent near Petersfield, one of 11 children of Henry and Arabella Prince of the Broken Head Ojibwe Nation. When he was 5, the family moved to the reserve at Scanterbury. His father was a hunter and a trapper, and he taught the boy the family trade the old way by consequences. Prince later recalled that he could put 5 bullets through a target the size of a playing card at about $100 minor. He went to the Elkhorn Residential School, finished grade 8, and left because the Depression meant his family needed the wages. He felled trees. He joined the Army Cadets as a teenager and loved it. As soon as I put my uniform on, I felt like a better man, he said later. Now, strip away every romantic notion you have about tracking, because what that childhood actually installed in him is the engine of this whole story. A footprint is the smallest part of it. What a trained reader follows is called sign, and sign is everywhere because a moving body cannot help producing it. Compression, soil pressed flat where weight landed. Transfer, mud carried onto stone, water carried onto dry ground. Bruised grass that slowly stands back up over hours, which makes it not just an arrow, but a clock. Overturned leaves showing the damp, dark side that normally faces the soil. Dew stripped from a stretch of grass in a clean line. A spider's web broken at knee height. In snow, the walls of a print are crisp when fresh and soften hour by hour. So, a good reader tells you not only that a man passed, but when, how heavy he was, how fast he moved, and whether he was calm or running for his life. Ground is not a surface. Ground is a document. And here's the sentence this entire video hangs on. Hiding a trail does not erase that document. It edits it clumsily. Brush out your footprints and you leave sweep marks and a patch of earth more uniform than nature ever makes it. Walk backwards to fake your direction, and you plant your weight where a walking man never does. Deep at the toe, dragged at the heel, step from rock to rock, and you scuff lichen that took decades to grow. Wade up a stream, and you still have to leave it somewhere, and a wet exit on a dry bank shouts louder than 100 prints. Every concealment technique trades one kind of evidence for another kind. To a boy who went hungry whenever he misread a marten's trail, the trade is perfectly legible, and the attempt itself is information. It says, someone trained past here recently moving that way, and he did not want to be followed. On a battlefield, that last clause is the most valuable sentence a piece of ground can utter. Hold on to that idea. Evidence exchanged, never erased. Because in a moment, an entire German division on an Italian canal is going to test it every night for 99 consecutive nights. There's one more thing the trapline taught, and it explains the almost eerie confidence these men showed against human enemies. An animal is a far harder quarry than a soldier. A deer weighs less, spooks easier, and has spent its whole existence practicing evasion. A man in army boots carrying 30 kilos of kit, tired, cold, and thinking about other things, is to someone educated on animals a printing press. The deer had been a harder teacher than the Wehrmacht would ever be. In 1940, Prince tried to bring that education to the Canadian Army, and the Army turned him away. Not once, several times, despite the fact that he easily met the requirements, and discrimination against Indigenous volunteers very likely played its part. He was finally accepted on June 3, 1940, and promptly buried as a sapper in the Royal Canadian Engineers, building huts and roads in England. 2 years of that. Then in 1942, a call went out for parachute volunteers, and Prince jumped at it, literally, earning wings and a place in the 1st Canadian Special Service Battalion. That battalion was about to be folded into something unprecedented. In 1942, out of an idea hatched in Lord Mountbatten's Combined Operations Staff, the United States and Canada created a joint commando force under an American officer named Robert Frederick, the 1st Special Service Force. The original scheme, a raid on hydroelectric plants in occupied Norway, was canceled. The selection standard was not. Recruiting letters went out across Army camps asking for single men aged 21 to 35. And occupations preferred read like the payroll of a fur trade post, rangers, lumberjacks, north woodsmen, hunters, prospectors, explorers, and game wardens. 697 Canadian officers and men crossed the border to train beside their American counterparts at Fort William Henry Harrison, outside Helena, Montana, drilled through parachuting, skiing, mountaineering, demolitions, and silent killing with a stiletto designed for the unit. Read that recruiting list again, and you will see the quiet revolution in it. For the first time in the modern era, an army had written the reader of ground directly into the design specification of a fighting unit. Nobody used the phrase, everybody understood the intent, and a trapper's son from Scanterbury walked into that unit as if it had been built around him, because in every way that mattered, it had. Men like Tommy Prince did not volunteer twice, first for a war, then for its most dangerous outfit, for glory. He said himself that he wanted to show his people were as good as any white man. Hitting the like button on this video is a small thing, but it keeps his name in front of people a little longer. And keeping the name visible is exactly what memory's made of. By the autumn of 1943, the force was in Italy, and the Allied advance on Rome had slammed into the German winter line, a chain of fortified mountains. One of them, Monte la Defensa, had thrown back attack after attack for weeks. Its defenders considered the sheerest face of the mountain effectively unclimbable, and so they barely watched it. You can already guess which way the force went up. What happened on that rock in the first days of December would put this unit on a collision course with the flattest, emptiest, most exposed battlefield in Italy, a stretch of reclaimed marsh where there was supposedly nowhere for anyone to hide. On the night of December 2nd, 1943, the force went up the face of La Defensa in the dark. Hauling themselves and their weapons up a near-vertical route the German defenders had written off, and by morning, the crest belonged to them. A position that had defied a whole Allied corps fell in hours. Holding it through the counterattacks that followed cost the unit hundreds of casualties, and more mountains came after. Hill 720, Monte Mahore, Monte Vicitaro. By January, the force was worn to the bone. There was no rest. On February 1st, 1944, the survivors landed at Anzio, the besieged Allied beachhead south of Rome, to replace 2 American Ranger battalions that had just been annihilated at Cisterna. The force now counted roughly 1,200 fighting men. The sector handed to them ran 13 kilometers along the Mussolini Canal, about a quarter of the entire beachhead perimeter, double the frontage assigned to a full American division on that same beach. They would hold it for 99 days without relief. They did not hold it by waiting. They held it by making the night their property. Faces blackened with boot polish, moving in small parties across the canal and deep into German territory. They killed sentries silently, took prisoners, and left behind printed stickers bearing the unit's red arrowhead and a sentence in German, Das dicke Ende kommt noch, the worst is yet to come. Watch what the German side did next, because this is where the promise in our title starts paying out in documented facts. Within days of the force taking over the sector, German units pulled their line back in places up to 800 meters just to get away from the patrols. Field Marshal Kesselring was forced to feed more men into that sector than he had ever planned. Frederick himself later recalled that after about 3 weeks, the Germans had pulled back so far that his patrols could no longer reach them and return in a single night. An order found on a captured German soldier warned that the men opposite were an elite Canadian-American force, treacherous, merciless, and clever, that no one could afford to relax against them, and that any soldier who captured even one would receive a 10-day furlough. One captured lieutenant admitted under interrogation that he had assumed the force was an entire division. It was 1,200 men, and in the middle of all this stood our sergeant from Scanterbury. On February 8th, near Liturno, Prince was sent forward to pinpoint German assembly points, including artillery the Allies could not locate and therefore could not silence. He picked an abandoned farmhouse standing roughly 200 meters from the enemy positions, ran 1,400 meters of telephone wire to it, and settled in alone at a window with a field telephone, reporting gun positions one by one. Then a shell cut his wire, and the reports went dead. What he did next has entered Canadian legend precisely because every element of it is documented. He found civilian clothes in the farmhouse. He put them on, picked up a hoe, and walked out into the field in full view of the German army, a farmer apparently furious that two warring armies were shelling his crops. He worked his way along the line of the buried wire, weeding as he went, until he found the break. Then he knelt down as if to tie his shoelaces and splice the wire together. For good measure, he stood up and shook his fist at the Germans, and then, playing the scene to perfection, turned and shook it at the Allied lines too. The reports resumed. 4 German positions were destroyed. His military medal citation credited his courage and utter disregard for personal safety. At Anzio, the men around Prince noticed something else. He carried moccasins in his pack and swapped them for his boots whenever a job needed absolute silence. Fellow soldiers described occasions when he slipped into enemy positions at night and left messages or walked off with a piece of equipment, not to kill, but to let the enemy discover at dawn that someone had stood among them while they slept. Men who knew Ojibwe tradition compared it to counting coup, the old test of courage in which touching an enemy and leaving proved more than harming him ever could. It was on this beachhead that a story began to circulate. A diary said to have been taken from the body of a German officer, containing the line, "The black devils are all around us every time we come into the line," and that they never heard them come. Time magazine printed the quote in 1944. Was the diary real or a legend polished by the force's own intelligence officers? Veterans never fully settled it, but here's the forensic point. The fear it described needed no invention. The pullback was real. The captured order was real. The 10-day furlough on offer for laying hands on even one of these men, that was real. Notice the German countermove, though, because it is the turn in this story. Faced with an enemy who read the ground, they hit harder. They pulled back, thinned their outposts, moved only at night, mined the likely approaches, and every one of those adjustments was itself legible. A withdrawal leaves a pattern. A freshly mined path is a confession about which routes matter. On the emptiest plain in Italy, a German division ended up ceding the entire space between the lines to 200 men, and in doing so, told those men exactly where its fears lived. Hiding did not protect the German line at Anzio. Hiding mapped it. In May, the beachhead finally broke open, and on June 4th, the force was first into Rome, seizing the Tiber bridges. Then, in August 1944, came southern France, and with it a completely different problem. At Anzio, the enemy had been static, dug in, waiting. In France, the German army was withdrawing through mountains, and withdrawal is the one maneuver on earth that cannot be performed without leaving a trail, which brings us back to 2 hungry men in the Maritime Alps, and to the question the Silver Star citation never answered. How exactly do you find a battalion that does not want to be found in mountains you've never seen, with no map reference to start from? On August 14, 1944, the force stormed the islands of Port Cros and Levant to open the invasion of southern France, then pushed onto the mainland with the 1st Airborne Task Force. The German units in front of them were falling back through the Maritime Alps, dissolving into terrain that swallows whole armies. On September 1st, Sergeant Prince and 1 private went out after them near Lescarène. This is the mission from the opening of this video, so now you can watch it with educated eyes. Deep behind the German line, the 2 men located what the entire Allied intelligence apparatus had not: the gun sites and encampment area of a German reserve battalion. On the way back, by the accounts of the action, They stumbled onto a firefight between German troops and French partisans and joined it on the French side, shooting from behind the Germans, with such effect that the partisan leader assumed a far larger force had come to his rescue. Then Prince kept walking, 70 kilometers across the mountains, 72 hours without food or water to deliver the report in person. After which he turned around and led the brigade back to the hidden camp himself and joined the attack. On September 5th, his regiment moved forward, occupied the heights, and wiped out the bivouac area. Around Lescaran, the force killed or captured a German battalion of roughly 1,000 men. Prince became one of only 59 Canadians of the entire war to receive the American Silver Star and one of just 3 to hold it alongside the military medal. Now we can finally answer the hardest word in this video's title. Not hiding, not trail, the word never. Because a fair-minded viewer should be asking, the Germans were not amateurs. Why did this keep happening for 30 years without the other side producing an answer? Understand first that Germany was arguably the best hider in Europe. Germans practically industrialized military concealment. Their word for it, Tarnung, covered an entire doctrine, and it was German snipers who taught the world the invisible war back in 1915. The German failure was not a failure of hiding technique. It was the absence of the counter skill in equal measure. And here is why they could not simply train it into existence. Camouflage is a technique. Techniques can be taught in weeks. How to break up a silhouette, how to sight a gun in shadow, how to move on a bearing at night. Reading ground is not a technique. It is a literacy acquired the way all literacies are acquired in childhood, through thousands of small corrections with real consequences attached. Misread the sign on a trap line, and your family eats less that week. No training course can compress that feedback loop any more than a 6-week course can give an adult the effortless fluency of a native speaker. Canada never trained this literacy. Canada recruited it from a living economy of bush, trapline, and hunt that still existed across the country in 1940 in its greatest concentration in Indigenous communities. And that had largely vanished from the industrial cities that filled the German army's ranks. An economy can build a rifle in a day and a pilot in a year. A reader of ground takes childhood. And by 1944, Germany had run out of childhoods to spend. One honest footnote belongs here. Not every Canadian reconnaissance man was Indigenous. The force's recruiting list welcomed anyone the bush had educated, prospector and game warden alike. But the deepest reserves of that education lay in Indigenous communities. They supplied the rarest military skill of the 20th century. And as the final part of this audit will show, they were repaid for it worst of all. That is the closing of the causal chain. So let me say it in plain words. Hiding never worked against these men, not because German concealment was poor, but because concealment does not delete evidence. It exchanges one kind for another, and Canada kept putting people in front of it who had been raised from the age of 5 on the exchange rate. To defeat them, the enemy would not have needed a better manual. He would have needed a different childhood. You might think the story ends in 1945. It does not, because the pattern got one more test against a completely different enemy, and this test is the part almost nobody talks about. In August 1950, 1 week after Canada announced a special force for Korea, Tommy Prince volunteered again. He was 34 now, his knees already ruined by years of hard service. He joined the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the 1st Canadian Army unit into the theater. And by February 1951, he was in action with the 27th Commonwealth Brigade. Understand what was waiting for him there. Chinese light infantry were, by common assessment of every army that faced them, among the finest night movers and camouflage disciplinarians on earth. Soldiers who had marched whole armies into Korea undetected, hiding by day, flowing over the hills by dark. If the pattern in our title was ever going to break, it would break here, against masters of the very art in question. It did not break. Soon after arriving, Prince, second in command of a rifle platoon, led an 8-man night raid, a snatch patrol, into an enemy camp. The party came back before dawn carrying 2 captured machine guns. More raids followed, and then came a turn nobody expected. It was his own side that flinched. His company commander, professing shock at how much risk these operations carried, began assigning Prince fewer patrols. The men of the platoon, notably, sided with their sergeant. In April 1951 came Kapyong, one of the hardest defensive actions of the war. The Patricias on Hill 677 covering a South Korean withdrawal, at one point completely surrounded, resupplied by airdrop, and still holding when the Chinese pulled back. 10 Patricias were killed and 23 wounded, and the battalion received the United States Presidential Unit Citation, the first ever awarded to a Canadian unit. Prince came back for a second tour in 1952 and was wounded on a position called the Hook that November. The knees finally gave out where no enemy had. He left the Army in 1954 with 11 medals, 3 wars worth of evidence, 3 different enemies, 1 unbroken pattern. That is what the record shows. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in the Patricias, in the Devil's Brigade, in a scout or sniper platoon, or walking point on those Korean hills, I would be honored to read their story in the comments. What unit? Where did they serve? What did they tell you? And what did they refuse to tell you? Those details matter more than any archive because the archives never held most of them in the first place. Prince came home with more decorations than almost any soldier in the country, and then something happened that no German patrol and no Chinese night attack had ever managed. He disappeared. Not in the mountains, into a city in plain sight of everyone. To understand how the man nobody could hide from was made invisible, we need the full verdict, and the verdict cuts both ways. Let's close the file the way a forensic audit should, by stating the causal chain in plain language, link by link. After 1914, war went underground, and hiding became the grammar of survival on every battlefield on Earth. Canada, almost by accident, held thousands of men who were fluent in the counter grammar. Men from communities where reading disturbed ground was not a skill, but a livelihood. The Army, half by wisdom and half by stereotype, pushed them into scouting and sniping in the First World War, and in 1942 finally built an entire unit to their specification. The mechanism underneath every one of their successes was the same. Movement writes on the world. Concealment can only exchange one kind of evidence for another, and to a lifetime reader, the exchange itself is a message. That is why a hidden sniper died opposite Pagamagabo, why a hidden division lost the night at Anzio, why a hidden battalion was erased above Lescaran, and why hidden camps in Korea gave up their machine guns before dawn. The hiders did not fail because they hid badly. They failed because they were writing to a reader. But this audit has one more page, and it is the hardest one. Francis Pagamagabo came home in 1919 with damaged lungs and 3 decorations, and applied for the farming support every veteran was promised. The local Indian agent, John Daly, obstructed him at nearly every turn. His application for a loan to buy horses was rejected 5 times. He became chief of his band in 1921 and spent 3 decades writing letters a government insisted on receiving only through the very agent who blocked him. By the end, the gas damage was so severe he slept sitting upright so his lungs would not fill. He died of a heart attack in 1952, the most decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian military history, and most of the country had never heard his name. Tommy Prince testified before a special parliamentary committee in 1947, asking Canada to honor its treaties and to grant his people better schools and the right to hunt, trap, and fish. The very rights that had produced the skill his country had just spent 5 years using. Like every status Indian, he could not vote in a federal election until 1960. Veterans' benefits flowed through channels that shut men like him out. His business failed. His knees ached. In 1955, walking past the Alexander Docks in Winnipeg, he saw a man drowning and dove in and saved him, because that reflex at least no country could take away. In the years that followed, he sold his medals to get by, lived in a Salvation Army shelter, and in 1976 was beaten on a Winnipeg street by a gang who had no idea who he was. He died at Deer Lodge Hospital on November 25, 1977 at 62. And then, for one day, the hiding stopped. More than 500 people came to his funeral. Soldiers of the Princess Patricias carried the coffin and draped it with the flag. Manitoba's lieutenant governor stood in the crowd beside the consuls of France, Italy, and the United States. 3 governments honoring a man his own had let fall. And, as the trumpet faded, 5 young men from the Broken Head Reserve chanted the death of a warrior song over the grave. Remember the rule that ran through this entire story. A trail cannot be erased, only exchanged. That rule applies to countries too. In 2000, Prince's medals surfaced at an auction, and his nephew Jim Bear raised $75,000 to bring them home. They sit today in the Manitoba Museum. In 2019, Canada declared him a person of national historic significance. The Army now runs an Indigenous recruiting program that carries his name. The sign was there all along, on the ground, waiting. It just took a country half a century to learn to read it. So here is the final verdict. The enemies of Canada lost the hiding war, not to sharper eyes, but to a deeper education. A literacy written into boys by fathers and elders on trap lines and shorelines, carried into 3 wars, and proven from Flanders to the Mussolini Canal to Hill 677. It could not be copied because it could not be rushed. And the men who carried it asked for almost nothing back and received even less. Nothing that moves through this world moves without leaving sign. Pegamagabo, Norwest, and Prince left theirs across 3 wars and 2 continents, and it leads directly to us. The least we can do is follow it and say their names. If this story changed the way you look at the hidden figures of history, please subscribe and like the channel. We are uncovering the history they tried to bury. Help us plant the seeds for the future. The next treasure will be revealed soon.